They laid the steak knives in front of themselves like royalty preparing for a feast, and in front of me, a plastic container of 3-day-old pasta. No plate. No napkin. Just leftovers scraped from the back of the fridge, still cold in patches. I remember staring at it, my hands trembling. Not from age, but from the sharp, humiliating clarity that comes only when someone you love shows you exactly how little they think of you. And yet, I said nothing. My name is Evelyn May Carter and I am 78 years old. I was raised to keep the peace, even when that peace is nothing but a pretty frame around a cracked family picture. I married young, loved deeply, worked hard, and believed, naively I suppose, that sacrifice guaranteed loyalty. Or at least respect. These days I live quietly in a house I once shared with my late husband, Richard. A man who'd never let me eat alone, let alone eat scraps while others dined like kings. Since he passed, my children have been different. Busier. Louder. More entitled. Their visits feel like obligations, their smiles rehearsed. But that night, the steak night, was the first time I felt truly invisible. The kitchen smelled of garlic butter and sizzling fat, the kind that coats the air with warmth. My eldest son, Mark, laughed so loudly his shoulders shook. My daughter-in-law scrolled through her phone between bites. And my youngest, Melissa, kept bragging about her weekend getaway like I wasn't sitting 3 feet away, pushing cold noodles around a cheap plastic container. At some point I whispered, "I could have cooked something." "No, Mom," Mark said, waving his fork. "We got it." They didn't get it. They forgot me. Or maybe they remembered me just enough to keep me presentable, like an old portrait hanging too high on the wall to dust. I thought that was the worst part of my night. But dawn has a way of revealing truths the night tries to hide. At 5:42 a.m., while the sky was still navy and I was sipping my weak peppermint tea, my phone rang. It was Melissa. "Mom," she yelled. "My credit card's not working. None of them are. Did the bank freeze something? Did something happen?" I stared at the wall. Calm, quiet, almost serene. "Yes," I said softly. "Something happened. They didn't know yet. But that dinner had consequences. Long overdue consequences. And I was done being silent. Before the arrogance, before the entitlement, before the slow erosion of their decency, my home used to be a place of warmth, not worry. I grew up in a little New England town where neighbors left pies on each other's porches and children shouted good night across the yard. My mother smelled like lilacs. My father like sawdust and pipe tobacco. I remember evenings when the world felt safe, soft as a wool blanket warmed by the fire. Richard and I built a life like that. He'd whistle off-key when he cooked. He'd kiss my forehead every morning and say, "Evie, you make this house a home." And when we finally had children, I poured every ounce of softness I had into them. Birthday cakes from scratch. Hand-stitched Halloween costumes. Late-night fevers soothed with stories and cold cloths. I believed that if you love your family enough, they stay kind. I didn't understand then how adulthood sharpens edges. How growing up can mean growing away. How children, once sweet, can learn selfishness like it's a language spoken everywhere except their childhood home. The red flags began small. Dishes left for me to wash after they visited, bills quietly placed on the corner of my table, Mother's Day gifts bought from clearance racks with receipts still inside. They weren't unkind, just inattentive. Careless. Then when Richard died, the shift was immediate. "Mom," Mark had said at the funeral, "don't worry, we'll take care of everything." Everything turned out to mean, my finances, my home maintenance, my independence. They insisted I shouldn't stress. They insisted I give them access for emergencies. And I, still grieving, still adrift, agreed. I didn't realize that in protecting me they also began controlling me. It was slow at first. They corrected what I spent money on. Told me which home repairs I could approve. Told me not to waste money on little pleasures like fresh flowers or new books. I complied. Out of love. Out of trust. Out of habit. But that night at the dinner table, watching them eat steak while I sat with cold leftovers, that was when the years scattered like broken glass at my feet and I finally saw everything clearly. This wasn't care. This was convenience. And soon they would learn, gently but firmly, that they had underestimated me. The moment Melissa's panicked voice crackled through the phone that morning, something inside me shifted, quietly like a door clicking shut in a long hallway. I had spent years swallowing my hurt, convincing myself that their careless behavior wasn't intentional, that children grow distracted, not cruel. But cold pasta on a table full of steak had a way of stripping away excuses. I didn't raise selfish children, I told myself. But perhaps I raised children who learned to take advantage of the one person who never said no. And so, in the weeks leading up to that dinner, after yet another incident where Mark suggested I shouldn't handle my own bills anymore, I made a decision that still felt both terrifying and peaceful. I reviewed everything I owned, everything I had quietly sustained since Richard's passing. And then I changed it. All of it. The accounts they had access to. The cards they used temporarily and never returned. The credit lines they believed would replenish themselves forever. I closed accounts. Redirected funds. Protected what was mine. And I did it not out of anger but out of a deep, clear understanding. They had stopped seeing me as their mother and started seeing me as a resource. A bank. A convenience. A safety net they could punch holes through and still expect to hold. So when Melissa called at dawn, breathless with indignation, I didn't tremble the way I once would have. I simply stirred my tea and said, "Yes, dear, I made some changes." Silence hit the line like cold water. "Changes," she repeated, her voice sharpening. "What kind of changes?" I could almost hear her mind racing. Mortgage payments, credit card bills, vacation plans. All the luxuries she believed were self-earned when in reality, she had been leaning on me more than she ever admitted. "Mom, what did you do?" she snapped, and for the first time there was fear in her tone. Not fear for me. Not fear about me. Fear of losing access. "I protected myself," I said simply. Her breath hitched. "Protected yourself from who?" And I answered softly, the truth settling between us like dust in sunlight. "From the people who forgot I raised them." She tried to backpedal, her voice wobbling between outrage and manipulation. "We didn't forget you," Mark said. "Don't bring your brother into this," I said, still calm. "He'll be calling soon anyway." I hung up gently, not angry, not abrupt, just done. I sat alone in my kitchen, the kettle still warm, the morning light tracing soft gold lines across the table. The house was quiet in the way only old houses can be, full of echoes. I could almost hear Richard clearing his throat before saying something wise in that unhurried way he had. He always believed people reveal themselves when they think no one is watching. And in the last few years, I had been watching more closely than my children realized. Mark called next, of course. Hammering. Accusing. Outraged that I had messed with things without consulting him. Me, consulting him, about my own life. "It's irresponsible, Mom. You shouldn't be making these decisions alone." That was the moment I felt something inside me melt. Not pain, not bitterness, but the last remnants of a belief I had clung to for too long, that they knew better than I did. "I've been making decisions alone for nearly 80 years, I told him. "I think I'll manage." There was a long pause. A stunned, offended kind of silence. Then he lowered his voice, trying to regain control. "Mom, listen. This is all a misunderstanding. We were just trying to help." Help. Such a pretty word when it isn't hiding condescension underneath. "Mark," I said, "help is when you support someone without taking pieces of them in the process." He exhaled sharply, caught between pride and panic. "Can we talk about this in person?" "We will," I replied. "But on my terms." When I ended the call, my hand trembled, not because I doubted myself, but because reclaiming yourself at nearly 80 feels like stepping into a new, strange light after years of dim corners. I had been afraid for so long of upsetting them, of being a burden, of causing conflict. But there is something powerful about age. When you finally realize you have far less to lose than you once feared and far more self-respect to regain. Their credit cards were frozen. Their access gone. Their entitlement abruptly cut off. And for the first time in years I felt safe inside my own life. The real confrontation, though, the one that would crack every illusion open, was still waiting just around the corner. And they weren't ready for it. But I was. By mid-morning, the calls had piled into a small mountain of missed notifications. Mark twice more, Melissa 4 times, my daughter-in-law once, and even a terse text from my son-in-law. "We need to talk ASAP." A younger version of me would have panicked, scrambling to make peace, smoothing over misunderstandings that weren't misunderstandings at all. But that morning I didn't rush to answer a single one. I made myself oatmeal with cinnamon, sliced a pear, and sat at the small table Richard built for us in our first year of marriage. The wood was worn smooth by decades of our hands, our elbows, our quiet shared meals. I traced my fingers over the familiar grooves, grounding myself. Strength often feels softer than people expect. It doesn't roar. It steadies. I thought back to the first time I noticed something was wrong with my children. Not the usual growing pains of adulthood, but something deeper, something like entitlement creeping in through the cracks. It was 2 years after Richard died. I had been widowed only 18 months and still cried into his pillow some nights. Mark had come over with glossy brochures for a senior financial management service. He spread them across my coffee table like a salesman. "Mom, you're vulnerable," he said, his tone infuriatingly paternal. "You shouldn't be dealing with money alone." I remember how small I felt as he slid papers toward me, papers that would give him access to everything. Melissa had chimed in saying, "We'll handle things. You shouldn't stress at your age." At my age. I was 75, not 98. I still drove. Still cooked. Still read the newspaper every morning. Yet they spoke to me as if I were unraveling. Now I see how subtle it was. How they slowly made decisions for me. Made purchases on my behalf. Shifted bills. Encouraged me to trust them with the details. First I assumed it was love. Then habit. Then convenience. And finally, I had to face the truth. It became dependence. Not mine. I finished breakfast and finally picked up Mark's most recent voicemail. His voice was tight, clipped, the way it always got when he felt a situation slipping away from him. "Mom," he said, "this is serious. A lot of payments are tied to those accounts. I don't know what you did, but you need to call me back immediately. We can't be doing things behind each other's backs." Behind each other's backs. The irony nearly made me laugh. They had orchestrated an entire financial system around me, and somehow I was the one being deceitful for taking back my own name. But beneath his frustration there was something else. Fear. And that fear confirmed something I'd ignored for far too long. They were living beyond their means, counting on my assets as a cushion. My silence had made me complicit. And I was done being complicit. Late morning sunlight poured through the kitchen window, and for a moment, I allowed myself a breath of guilt. Not guilt for what I'd done, I knew I was right, but guilt for letting it get to this point. A mother's instinct never fully fades, even when her children act foolishly. I worried about them. But I reminded myself, boundaries are not cruelty. Protection is not punishment. I decided the confrontation needed to happen sooner rather than later. If I didn't take control of the narrative, they would twist it into something unrecognizable, accusing me of confusion, fragility, forgetfulness. They'd done it before in small ways. "Mom, you must have forgotten. Mom, that isn't what happened. Mom, we're trying to help, you're just overwhelmed." Little manipulations disguised as concern. I walked through my house slowly, letting the quiet strengthen me. I paused to straighten a picture of Richard and me on our 40th anniversary, his arm around my waist, his smile still mischievous after all those years. He'd always encouraged my independence. He'd tell me, "Evie, people show their true character in how they treat the ones who can't push back." Well, now I could push back. By noon, my children were practically buzzing around each other in their group chat. Something I'd been added to once but muted because it was nothing but petty squabbles and vacation photos. Now it was full of panic. "Did Mom talk to you? What did she say? We have to get over there." I waited until the flurry quieted, picked up my phone and typed a single message into the group. "Please come by the house at 5 p.m. We'll discuss everything then. Mom." No apologies. No explanations. No frantic reassurances. Just a time, a place, and their mother finally standing up straight. As I set the phone down, a strange calm washed over me, like the moment before a storm breaks, when the air feels heavy but honest. Tonight they would have to face me without excuses, without manipulation, and without access to the accounts they had quietly drained for years. And for the first time in a long time I felt ready, not to fight loudly but to speak the kind of truth that doesn't need volume to be heard. The hours leading up to 5 o'clock moved with the slow, deliberate weight of an old grandfather clock. Steady, inevitable, impossible to rush. I spent most of the afternoon putting my house in order, not because I expected company, but because I needed to feel rooted. Preparing my space felt like preparing my spirit. I folded the Afghan on the couch, watered my violets, dusted the mantel where Richard's urn sat. A simple bronze container he would have teased for being far too serious, for a man who never took himself seriously at all. I touched the cool metal gently and whispered, "Wish me strength, love." Then I brewed a fresh pot of tea, the chamomile filling the kitchen with a gentle apple-like sweetness. It was a quiet scent, unthreatening, steady, the opposite of the gathering storm outside my front door. Sometimes power isn't loud. Sometimes it smells like chamomile. At 4:20 I heard the first car door slam. Earlier than expected. Mark, of course. He'd always been the one to try taking control of a situation by arriving first, planting himself like a flag. His heavy footsteps hit the porch with the same impatience he displayed as a child whenever he felt someone wasn't moving fast enough for him. I watched him through the lace curtain, arms crossed, jaw tight, phone in hand like it was a weapon he was preparing to wield. He didn't knock. He texted, "I'm here." I let him wait. At 4:35 came Melissa, her SUV too large, too loud for the street, like she needed the world to know she'd arrived. She stepped out with an urgency that felt rehearsed, dramatic even. She always performed emotion instead of sitting quietly with it. I wondered whether she even realized it anymore. By 4:50 both of them were on my porch, bickering in hushed tones. I watched them from the hallway mirror, not spying but witnessing. Seeing them for who they had become, not who I once thought they were. At 5 o'clock precisely I opened the door. Mark started immediately. "Mom, what is going on? We've been trying to reach you all day. This is ridiculous." I held up my hand, a gesture I rarely used but one my children had always obeyed instinctively. Even now they fell silent. Age has a strange authority. If you use it wisely, it doesn't fade. "Come inside," I said. "We'll talk in the living room." They walked in, stiff and suspicious like animals sniffing out a trap. I didn't rush them. I let them sit on the couch while I sat in my armchair, the same way I used to sit during parent-teacher conferences when they were young. Except this time I wasn't the one defending them. I was confronting them. The room felt thick with everything unsaid. Mark leaned forward, elbows on knees, trying to take control of the narrative. "Mom, listen. We didn't mean to upset you. Something got messed up with the accounts and it's created a huge problem. We need you to undo whatever you did so we can fix it." "Fix what?" I asked softly. "You know," Melissa said, crossing her arms, her voice sharp. "The freeze. The account's not working. The cards being declined. Whatever glitch you caused." "A glitch," I repeated, letting the word sit between us. "Is that what you think this is?" They exchanged a quick glance, confused, impatient, irritated. I took a slow breath. "There is no glitch. I closed the accounts. I revised the permissions. I took back what belongs to me." The silence that followed wasn't silence. It was shock expanding like a sudden burst of cold air. Mark's voice dropped into something harsh. "Mom, you can't just do things like that without telling us." The calm that washed over me was almost warm. "I can, Mark. I did. And I should have done it sooner." Melissa scoffed under her breath. "This is unbelievable. After everything we've done for you." I leaned forward and for the first time in years my voice didn't tremble. "What exactly have you done for me? Please, tell me." She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her eyes darted toward Mark, hoping he'd rescue her. He didn't. So I continued. "You've managed my accounts, yes. You've limited my spending. You've used my credit to cushion your lives. You've made decisions without my consent, and when I questioned any of it, you called me fragile, confused, overwhelmed." Mark stiffened. "We were protecting you." "Protecting me from what?" I asked. "From buying my own groceries? From repairing my own home? From having a life outside of what's convenient for you?" Neither of them could meet my eyes. The deepest betrayal is rarely a single moment. It is the accumulation of small abandonments, tiny cuts that eventually bleed you dry. And I had bled quietly for years. I folded my hands in my lap. "You forgot I am still alive. Not a memory. Not an obligation. Not an account to draw from." Melissa blinked hard, anger flickering with something like guilt. Mark's jaw clenched, but his shoulders sagged just slightly. I let the silence grow, not a weapon but a truth. "Tonight," I said, "we begin again. With honesty. With boundaries. And with consequences." The storm had arrived. But for the first time in a long time I wasn't afraid of it. I was standing in the calm center of it, quiet, steady, unshakable. The hours after that first confrontation stretched like an endless horizon, each minute steeped in tension, reflection, and a strange, liberating clarity. I didn't expect apologies. I didn't even expect understanding. What I did expect and quietly demanded was recognition, that they could no longer take me for granted. Recognition that I was still Evelyn May Carter, alive, capable, and deserving of respect, not leftovers or convenience. I spent the afternoon in my study, the sunlight through the blinds painting stripes across my old oak desk, as if the day itself were reminding me that clarity often comes in lines, in boundaries. I went through my personal files, my bills, my assets, making sure that nothing remained within reach of hands that had grown used to taking without thought. There was something profoundly healing in organizing, in reclaiming control, in seeing the tangible proof that I had built a life of substance for myself, and that it was mine to protect. And yet, even as I felt the empowerment of action, there was an ache that lingered, the ache of betrayal. Not the casual, minor betrayals that life throws at everyone, but the deep, gnawing betrayal of children who should have loved without condition. I remembered the birthdays I stayed up to prepare, the sleepless nights I nursed them through fevers, the encouragement I whispered when they doubted themselves. Every kindness I had extended had become, over time, a tool for entitlement. And now, facing them directly, I realized how easy it is for love to be mistaken for weakness when it is unwavering. My granddaughter, little Claire, was the only bright star in that otherwise stormy horizon. She came over mid-afternoon, her tiny hand slipping into mine, her voice gentle, grounding. "Grandma," she said, "why are they upset?" I smiled, brushing a stray silver strand from her forehead. "Because sometimes, my dear, people forget how to see the ones who love them. But that's okay, we just have to remind them." Her innocence was like water on parched soil. I felt hope rekindling, a reminder that kindness and love had not been lost entirely, that some hearts remained untarnished by entitlement. I prepared a simple tea for us both, letting the aroma of chamomile and honey fill the kitchen. Claire perched on the counter, legs swinging as I explained gently that tonight would be difficult, but it was necessary. "Sometimes," I said, "people only change when they feel the weight of their choices. And I've learned that the quietest, firmest decisions often teach the loudest lessons." By the time the evening came, I felt a quiet power settling into my bones, an unspoken promise to myself that nothing, no manipulation, no entitlement, no betrayal, would diminish my dignity again. When Mark and Melissa arrived, they found me calm, serene, sipping tea with Claire by my side, and not at all the frail, apologetic mother they expected. I let them stew in the room for a moment, the tension tangible, before speaking. "I've spent the day organizing my life," I began softly, "ensuring that I can live independently and safely. I've changed the accounts, the permissions, and the ways you could access them. This is not punishment, it is protection. For me." Mark's jaw tightened. "Mom, this is extreme." I held up my hand, my voice steady. "No, Mark. What is extreme is ignoring the boundaries I should have set years ago. What is extreme is assuming that a mother's love gives permission to overstep. Tonight we start again with respect or not at all." Melissa opened her mouth to argue, but I didn't give her the space to interrupt the lesson that years of quiet endurance had prepared me to teach. She faltered, and for the first time, I saw in her eyes a flicker of understanding, or at least hesitation. As they sat, tense and uncomfortable, I realized that my strength had grown not from anger or shouting, but from years of living, observing, and learning. True power does not need to roar. It settles quietly in the chest, in the hands that have labored, in the heart that has survived. And now it would speak for itself. Tonight they would begin to understand, not through confrontation, but through the unwavering calm of a woman who has finally remembered her own worth. The evening unfolded with a strange tension, neither entirely hostile nor entirely peaceful. Mark and Melissa sat stiffly on the couch, alternating between defensive explanations and hesitant glances at me. I kept my posture relaxed, my voice soft but unwavering, letting the calm in my body do more talking than words ever could. Claire sat between us, oblivious to the storm, humming quietly and doodling flowers in her little notebook. Her presence was grounding, a reminder that not all the world is cruel and not all lessons need to be learned in anger. I decided to start small, to give them a chance to recognize their own missteps without forcing them into shame. "Let's talk about what happened at dinner," I said. Their faces flinched as though I had struck a chord they weren't ready to hear. "I want you to understand something," I continued. "When you ate steak in front of me and handed me leftovers, you weren't just neglectful. You were sending a message. Whether you intended to or not, you showed me that my presence was less important than your convenience." Melissa's lips pressed tightly together. Mark shifted in his seat, arms crossing and uncrossing, the silent dance of someone trying to reconcile guilt and pride. I let the silence hang for a few moments, long enough for them to feel it, long enough for them to sit with it without distraction. "I've spent a long time protecting you, supporting you, and sometimes ignoring my own needs to make sure yours were met," I said softly, each word deliberate. "But this is not how respect works. Respect is not convenience. Love is not permission to take from someone without giving back." Mark's voice wavered when he finally spoke. "Mom, I didn't realize." "You didn't," I said gently, letting the truth settle like a pebble in still water. "And that is precisely why boundaries exist. Not to punish, not to shame, but to remind us all what is and isn't acceptable." Melissa finally spoke, quieter this time. We didn't mean to make you feel like that." Her words lacked the performative sharpness from before, edged now with hesitancy, almost remorse. "We just assumed." "Assumed is dangerous," I said. "It can make children forget that their parents are people too. That mothers are capable of saying no, of taking action to protect themselves, of living fully even when the world expects them to shrink." The room fell silent again. Claire looked up at me and smiled, as if sensing that this was a rare, important moment. A moment where truth and love could coexist, where lessons could be absorbed without shame. I reached over and brushed her hair from her forehead. "Yes, Claire," I said, "sometimes you have to speak softly to make the loudest point." I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The tension did not vanish, but the rigid postures softened slightly. They were beginning to understand, not fully, but enough to see that I was no longer the woman who would silently absorb indignity. Enough to feel that their mother's strength had been underestimated. By the time they left that evening, there was no dramatic declaration of change, no miraculous apologies. But there were small acknowledgments, subtle nods of recognition, a careful awareness in their eyes that things had shifted. They had been reminded, gently but firmly, that I was not an endless well to draw from, that my life and choices belonged first to me, and that their convenience was not my obligation. After the door closed behind them, I sat in the quiet living room, listening to the soft tick of the old clock and the muted chirping of the crickets outside. Claire was already asleep in her little bed, exhausted from the day's emotional weight, yet peaceful. I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of measured victory. Not loud, not showy, not vengeful, but profound. The quiet, I realized, was more powerful than any shout. And the lessons I had begun to teach tonight would echo far longer than anger ever could. From this moment forward, I would move deliberately, with patience and precision, letting my actions, my boundaries, and my unwavering calm speak louder than any confrontation. My quiet strength was finally reclaiming the life I had spent years protecting in silence. The next morning I rose early as I always have, but with a new sense of purpose. The house smelled faintly of rain from the night before, and the faint aroma of my freshly brewed coffee mingled with the lingering scent of chamomile from the previous evening. I sat at my old oak desk, notebooks spread before me, lists forming like careful stepping stones. This was not anger. This was strategy, calm, deliberate, precise. After years of bending, of giving, of being overlooked, I realized I no longer needed to react. I could act on my own terms. I began by reviewing every account, every subscription, every shared payment. For decades, I had allowed Mark and Melissa to handle what they called the details, assuming it was care. Now I saw it for what it had become: subtle control. My fingers traced each line in the statements, each past transaction, each authorization. I noted patterns, the hidden ways they had relied on my resources without asking. My heart ached briefly, not for the money, but for the realization that love had been repurposed as entitlement. Then I shook it off. I was not going to let guilt paralyze me. Next, I consulted quietly with my lawyer, a gentleman in his 70s who had known Richard and me for decades. I didn't tell him my emotional story in detail. I simply asked for the tools I needed: clear legal protection, access restructuring, and security measures that respected my independence. Every recommendation he gave felt like a brick in the wall I was finally building around my life. Not a wall to keep them out entirely, but one that made it impossible for them to exploit me. By late morning, I had begun drafting gentle but firm letters explaining my new boundaries. I wrote not in accusation but in truth. I detailed what actions I had taken, why they were necessary, and what behaviors would be acceptable moving forward. Each word was carefully chosen, the sentences structured with the deliberate precision of someone who had been underestimated for decades. My goal was not to humiliate them, though that would certainly be a side effect, but to establish clarity, permanence, and accountability. I paused mid-afternoon to sit with Claire in the garden. She picked flowers and tucked them into a small jar, the sunlight catching the dewdrops on their petals. "Grandma," she asked, "are they mad at you?" I smiled, brushing soil from her hands. "Perhaps," I said gently. "But sometimes, people are angry when they realize they can't take what doesn't belong to them. And that's okay. It's a lesson they need to learn." She looked at me with wide, trusting eyes, and I realized how much hope she gave me. Not hope that they would suddenly be perfect, but hope that kindness and fairness still mattered, that the next generation might see what I had fought to protect. That evening, I reviewed my plans one more time. I made sure my phone, my accounts, and even my daily routines could not be manipulated. I considered every possible excuse they might make, every appeal to guilt or manipulation, and I anticipated them quietly. Power, I reminded myself, is not loud or vengeful. It is calm, it is measured, it is enduring. And finally, I allowed myself a small, private smile. I had waited too long to reclaim my life, but the moment had come. They had underestimated me for years. They had believed my age and my quiet demeanor meant compliance. They were about to learn that beneath the soft-spoken exterior was a woman who had lived decades with wisdom, patience, and an understanding of human nature that they had yet to comprehend. The quiet power I had cultivated over the morning was only the beginning. Tomorrow I would begin to confront their dependence on me in ways they couldn't ignore. Subtle, strategic, and unassailable. And this time there would be no room for denial. No room for manipulation. Tonight, I would sleep with the satisfaction of someone who had finally reclaimed her narrative. And for the first time in years, I felt truly free. The days that followed were quiet, almost deceptively normal. My children tiptoed around my house, checking messages, making calls, testing the boundaries I had drawn, but I remained calm, serene, unyielding. I noticed, with a certain sharp satisfaction, how uneasy they had become. The sense of entitlement that had carried them for so long was faltering. They were beginning to understand that I was no longer a passive participant in their convenience. I decided it was time to uncover the full extent of their dependence. Quietly, methodically, I reviewed every joint account, every shared credit card, and every past transaction I could access. What I discovered was more than I had expected. My children had not merely relied on me, they had been reckless with what was mine. Vacations booked on my credit, high-end electronics purchased without consent, bills conveniently shifted into my name so they could appear financially responsible while draining my resources. Each entry on the statements was a small betrayal, a proof of entitlement that had been normalized over decades. The shock of seeing it laid bare was tempered by clarity. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to accuse. I simply needed to know the truth, and the truth gave me power. Every dollar they had mismanaged, every unauthorized purchase, was a thread I could trace, a pattern that revealed not just carelessness but expectation. An expectation that I would always be the safety net, the invisible foundation they could take for granted. That evening Claire came over. She had an innocence and a curiosity that felt like light in a dark room. "Grandma," she asked, "why did they do that?" I sighed, holding her small hand in mine. Because sometimes people forget what respect looks like. Sometimes they confuse love with permission. But that's okay. We're going to help them remember. Her trust in me felt like a small blessing, a reminder that my fight was not just for myself, but for the example I could set for the next generation. I didn't confront them immediately with the financial details. That would have been satisfying, yes, but it wasn't the lesson I wanted them to learn. Instead, I allowed their discomfort to simmer, their anxiety to rise, while I continued to fortify my position. I reviewed my accounts again, checked my legal protections, and documented everything. I was not just protecting my assets, I was reclaiming my autonomy, my dignity, and my voice. By the time I prepared tea that night, the house was quiet. I sat at the table, the steam rising from the cup, and reflected on the years that had led to this moment. I thought of Richard and how he would have been proud of my clarity, my patience, my quiet resolve. I thought of Claire and the lessons she would carry into adulthood, the importance of self-respect, boundaries, and the courage to act even when it feels uncomfortable. For the first time in a long while, I felt a profound sense of anticipation. The reckoning was not about punishment. It was about truth, about ensuring that my children could no longer ignore reality. They would see, eventually, that their mother was no longer invisible, no longer silent, and no longer a resource to be drained. And I, in turn, would move forward with strength, not anger, with calm, not chaos. The seeds of understanding were planted. All that remained was to watch them grow, and to prepare for the moments when they would have no choice but to acknowledge the life they had taken for granted. Tonight, I would sleep knowing that every step I had taken was deliberate. Every boundary I had drawn was a message. And in the quiet of my home, the truth was no longer hidden. It was mine. By the 10th day, the tension in my home had become almost tangible. My children moved cautiously, almost as if walking on a floor they feared might collapse under their own entitlement. Mark, who had once dominated conversations and decisions with an air of self-assured authority, now paused before speaking, measuring each word. Melissa hovered, unsure whether to argue or apologize, a tightness in her chest that I had rarely seen. It was not satisfaction that filled me. It was quiet confirmation that the lessons I had set in motion were beginning to work. I didn't confront them directly at first. Instead, I allowed subtle truths to surface. Bills went unpaid in their own names. Notices arrived. Requests for clarification from banks and service providers flooded them with reminders they could no longer ignore. Each phone call, each email, each polite inquiry was a reflection of their dependency, laid bare not by anger or accusation, but by their own inability to manage without me. I watched their reactions closely, noting the flickers of shame, the twitch of surprise, the slight flush of panic when they realized the extent of what they had relied upon me for. Mark tried to take charge in one conversation, demanding explanations and making excuses, but I simply repeated, calmly and firmly, "I have already taken the necessary steps. These are your responsibilities now." There was no arguing, no pleading, no room for manipulation. I had removed their crutches, and they were discovering, with no small amount of discomfort, how heavy the weight of their choices truly was. In the evenings, I spent time with Claire in the garden. She asked questions, the kind that cut through the noise of entitlement and self-interest. "Grandma, why aren't they saying sorry?" I held her small hands, feeling the pulse of innocence and hope. "Because, my dear, sometimes people need to feel the full weight of what they've done before they understand. Words are easy, lessons are hard." I saw in her eyes that she was absorbing more than I realized, learning that strength does not always shout, that dignity can be a quiet, unyielding force. By the middle of the week, I began to see small changes. Melissa stopped interrupting so often. Mark hesitated before making demands, as if weighing the validity of his own impulses against the quiet authority I now projected. They still tested the boundaries, of course, but each test was met with gentle firmness rather than reactive anger. I had learned over decades that patience often wields more power than confrontation. It was during one of these moments, when Mark tried to explain away a forgotten bill, that I spoke softly, letting the words linger. "Mark, when I was raising you, I made sacrifices so you could have stability, so you could learn responsibility. But responsibility is not inherited, it is practiced. And you, my son, have learned that too slowly. That is why I've had to step in." His face, usually so quick to deflect, betrayed a flash of recognition. A small crack in the armor of entitlement had appeared. I realized then that the quiet power I had cultivated, the strategic reclaiming of my life, the patient observation, the calm enforcement of boundaries, was more effective than any confrontation I could have staged. Their reckoning was unfolding naturally. Every discomfort, every surprise, every challenge they faced without my previous support was a lesson delivered without a single raised voice. By nightfall, I made tea and sat by the window watching the sky darken. Claire slept nearby, her soft breathing a reminder that hope and innocence remain even in the face of human flaws. I thought about the path we had walked, the betrayal, the humiliation, the careful rebuilding of trust and self-respect, and felt a quiet pride. The truth was no longer hidden. Their dependence had been exposed, and I had learned how to wield my strength not with fury, but with patience, strategy, and unwavering calm. Tomorrow I would continue this work, not with vengeance but with wisdom. Because power, I realized, is not loud. Power is quiet, deliberate, and enduring. And tonight I slept in the serenity of a life reclaimed. The evening of the final confrontation arrived with the stillness of anticipation. My children, Mark and Melissa, entered my home with that familiar mix of defensiveness and uncertainty. This time, however, I didn't rise to greet them with anxiety or apology. I stayed seated, calm and composed, Claire quietly at my side, her presence a gentle anchor in the room. The air smelled faintly of lavender and freshly baked bread, a sensory reminder of home and comfort, a contrast to the storm of emotions they carried. I began softly, letting each word land slowly, deliberately. I've spent the past weeks observing, reflecting, and reclaiming what belongs to me. Not to punish you, not to humiliate you, but to restore clarity and fairness in our family. I paused, letting the words settle. Their eyes, usually filled with expectation, widened slightly, uncertainty flickering across their faces. I could see them calculating, measuring, wondering what approach I would take. You have relied on me long past the point of care or necessity, I continued, my voice steady but gentle. You have treated my resources as though they were endless, my patience as though it had no limit. And yet you have forgotten the very lessons I spent decades teaching you: respect, responsibility, and accountability. Melissa shifted uncomfortably, her fingers twisting in her lap. Mom, she began, but I held up a hand. No excuses, I said, soft but firm. This is not about excuses. This is about truth. Every transaction, every expectation, every assumption of my compliance has consequences. Mark's usual defensive tone cracked slightly. We didn't realize. I know, I interrupted gently. And that is the point. Realizing comes too late when you rely on love as a safety net. But understanding can come now if you allow it. I let a pause linger, giving them space to reflect, the weight of their choices pressing gently but firmly upon them. I spoke of small moments, specific events, gentle reminders of times when I had been overlooked or diminished. Not to shame but to illustrate. Dinner with the steak, I said, my voice soft, almost tender. The leftovers. The subtle dismissals. These moments are not just memories, they are markers of behavior patterns that have continued too long. Their eyes flickered, guilt mingling with realization. Mark's jaw tightened, Melissa's eyes glistened with the beginnings of tears. They were listening, not just hearing but truly hearing. I leaned slightly forward, my hands folded, my tone unwavering. I do not act from anger. I act from clarity. I am not seeking revenge. I am seeking respect. And from this moment on, that respect is non-negotiable. You will recognize my boundaries, my autonomy, and my worth. You will no longer rely on me as a convenience. And if you choose to ignore this, you will face the natural consequences of your actions. Silence followed. Not the uneasy, tense silence of confrontation, but the heavy, reflective silence of truths absorbed. They looked at me with a mixture of fear, understanding, and perhaps the first genuine respect in years. Claire stirred beside me, rubbing her eyes, her presence a quiet, innocent affirmation that this was the right path. I ended softly, not with a shout, not with a threat, but with a statement of quiet, enduring strength. I love you, I said. But love does not give permission to take without regard. Remember that always. They left that evening not in anger but in reflection. No dramatic apologies, no desperate attempts to regain control. Just a quiet understanding that their mother had changed, that the woman they had underestimated for decades was no longer silent, no longer passive, and no longer invisible. As I closed the door, I felt a sense of calm I had not known for years. The confrontation was complete, not with fury or theatrics, but with the quiet, steady power of someone who had finally reclaimed her life, her voice, and her dignity. Tonight, the house was peaceful, full of the soft hum of normalcy and the lingering scent of lavender. I sat by the window watching the stars emerge one by one, and felt a profound sense of completion. The truth had been spoken. The lesson delivered. And the quiet power I had nurtured had spoken louder than any anger ever could. The days after the confrontation were quiet, gentle in a way I had not expected. My children no longer barged in with entitlement or unearned expectations. There was a cautious respect now, subtle, almost imperceptible at times, but it was real. They called before visiting, they asked permission rather than assuming access, and I began to see glimmers of understanding in their eyes, small, hesitant, but promising. It was not a miracle of sudden change, but a beginning of a transformation that I had hoped for quietly for decades. I spent the mornings with Claire, tending to the garden or baking simple treats. Her laughter filled the house, reminding me that love is not diminished by boundaries but strengthened. She was a living anchor, a gentle proof that the world still held purity, curiosity, and respect. Sitting with her, I often reflected on my life, the years with Richard raising my children, the betrayals and disappointments, and the eventual reclaiming of my autonomy. Each memory was a thread in the tapestry of who I had become, resilient, patient, and wise. Evenings were my own again, filled with quiet rituals I had almost forgotten in the chaos of caregiving and compromise. I read by the lamp, listening to the soft creak of the house settling into night. The air smelled faintly of chamomile tea and the lingering warmth of the fire I kept burning, a symbol of life, endurance, and clarity. I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my own survival, not just in the physical sense but in the emotional reclamation of dignity, power, and peace. I reflected often on the lessons learned. Betrayal had been painful, yes, but it had also been illuminating. I had learned that age does not demand passivity, that respect must be claimed as fiercely as love is given. I had learned that quiet strength often wields more influence than loud anger, and that patience, observation, and deliberate action can create profound change. Most importantly, I had learned that reclaiming your life is not selfish. It is essential, and it creates space for healthier, more honest relationships to grow. One afternoon, Mark came to me with a hesitant smile. "Mom, I think we've been taking you for granted," he admitted, voice soft, the first genuine humility I had seen in years. Melissa nodded beside him, eyes downcast. It was not dramatic, not theatrical, but it was real. I smiled gently, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. "That's all I've ever wanted," I said. "Not blind obedience, not dependence. Just recognition, respect, and honesty. That is enough." As the weeks passed, the tension dissolved into a quiet equilibrium. My children began managing their own lives, sometimes faltering, sometimes seeking guidance, but always with an acknowledgement of my boundaries. And I, in turn, felt a profound sense of freedom, a liberation born not from rebellion, but from the measured, deliberate reclaiming of my voice and agency. At night, I often sit by the window, the stars casting silver light across the garden where Claire plays and grows, and I feel an almost sacred peace. Life has a way of testing us, of showing who truly sees us and who takes for granted the love and labor we offer. But it also has a way of restoring balance when we find the courage to stand firm, to speak softly but clearly, and to act with both intelligence and heart. I have learned that true power is quiet, deliberate, and enduring. That love, when paired with self-respect, does not diminish, it amplifies. And that even at 78, life can offer clarity, reconciliation, and the serenity of a woman who has reclaimed her dignity, her voice, and her peace. As I pour another cup of chamomile, listening to the night settle gently around my home, I whisper a soft, private affirmation. I am enough. I am strong. I am free. And in that moment, the world feels both vast and intimate, filled with the quiet power of a life finally lived on my own terms.